Hello and have a good day everyone. My name is Siddhi Upadhyay and I'm a volunteer at Applied Forensic Research Science. Today's my presentation topic is biological basis of neuron, and I'm going to cover in this presentation is the basic introduction of a biological basis of neuron, brain anatomy, that it consists of brain lobes and their lessons. So this is the structure. We are going to study the structure and function of brain. So this is the structure of brain. The cerebral cortex is divided into four lobes: occipital lobes, temporal lobes, parietal and frontal lobe. Occipital lobe, this pink portion is called occipital. This is a temporal lobe. This is a parietal lobe, and this is a frontal lobe. We will go each one of the lobe one by one. First is the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe, located at back of brain, contains the primary visual cortex, which is responsible for interpreting incoming visual information. So basically it is responsible for a visual reception, visual spatial processing and interpretation, and color and motion recognition. That is in directing visual awareness to important features in the environment. Any damage to the occipital lobe can lead to visual impairments, including difficulty in recognizing or naming objects, visual hallucination, or blindness. Next is temporal lobe. Temporal lobe, largely responsible for creating and perceiving both conscious and a long-term memory. It plays a role in a visual and a sound processing, and it is critical for object recognition and language recognition. So, temporal lobe, situated just above the ears on the lower middle sides of the cerebral cortex, contains the primary auditory cortex. This lobe is mainly responsible for processing all auditory information. The posterior region of a left temporal lobe contains a wrinkle area, which is responsible for receptiving in a language, and the lobe also the lobes also house the hippocampus, which is responsible for a consolidation of a new long-term verbal and visual memories. Any damage to the temporal lobe will lead to a memory problem, as well as the problem with the speech perception, hearing, and received language. If we go to a specifically in the left and right temporal lobe, then left temporal lobe, if it is damaged, then it might get affect to audio and visual recalls, word recognitions, memory for verbal material. Any damage to the right temporal lobe, that will result in a problem recognizing and remembering visual or audio content. Parietal lobe, situated between the frontal and occipital lobe and above a temporal lobe. Parietal lobe allow to coordinate our movement in a response to the object in our environment through the use of visual pathway. So it is mainly responsible for receiving and interpreting the sensory information from various parts of the body. Also, it is responsible for attention, spatial orientation, reading, and voluntarily motion, as well as the complex visual processing such as mentally rotating three-dimensional shapes. Damage to the left parietal lobe can lead to aphasia, agnosia, equularia, or a finger agnosia. Damage to the right parietal lobe, generally it cause like less self-care, like less self-esteem type of thing, that is impaired a personal care and impaired a drawing ability. Next is bilateral parietal lobe damage can result in a Balient syndromes, which is characterized by an inability to perceive the visual field as a whole. difficulty in fixing the eyes, inability to move the hands to a specific object by using a vision. Next is a frontal lobe. Most anterior part of the brain. Frontal lobe is called the most anterior part of the brain. It extends from an area behind the forehead. Frontal lobe responsible for a higher cognition functions such as memory, emotions, impulse control, problem solving, social interaction, and a motor function. So mainly it is responsible for information of all voluntarily movements, including a speech production. It includes the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for a higher cognitive and executive function. The lower left frontal lobe contains a Broca's area, which is responsible for expressive language. So next is prefrontal cortex. Also, it represents as a PFC. Prefrontal cortex is mainly responsible for higher cognitive or executive function, what have been referred to as a top-down processing, or the application of cognition to perception or stimuli to inform response. So basically it do inhibitory control, complex motor programming, feed forward system executive function, intelligence problem solving, analytical thinking, reductionist, non-linear thinking, strategic, cognitive control of emotions. So these all are the functions which is functioned by a PFC. Parts of PFC, dorsolateral and ventromedial. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex has extensive neural connection to sensory and motor corticals and is involved in the regulation of action, thoughts and attention. Ventromedial prefrontal cortex has extensive connection to the limbic system and is engaged in the regulation of emotional response. PFC includes the orbitofrontal cortex, which is involved in a goal selection and the ability to understand and evaluate the future rewards. Orbitofrontal cortex functions in a personality and a social behavior, spontaneous arousal and attention, arousal, motivation and drives. The functions of orbitofrontals are like personality and social behavior, spontaneous arousal and attention, arousal, motivation, drive, focus, attention, goal directed and a purposeful behavior, initiating behavior, ability to change a mental state, appropriateness of emotional and behavior. If any damage to happen in orbitofrontal lobe, it causes impairment of the above function. All these functions will get impairments. Next is dorsolateral. It's executive function and working. It helps in executive function and working memory, complex motor programming, fluency of verbal, that is speech and thinking, and a visual designs. Organizational capacity in learning, constructional strategy for coping and building complex visual designs. Hypothesis testing and changing mental state. Any damage to the dorsolateral cortex cause impairment in the above functions. Next is anterior cingulate function. Anterior cortex. Anterior cingulate cortex regulates blood pressure and heart rate. Its psychological functions include decision making and evaluation process. Anterior cingulate cortex, that is the evaluation of choice, executive and cognitive controls, emotional modulation, effect of frontal lessons like personality, behavior and emotional change, impairment seen in the form of reduction of motivation, purposiveness, goal direction and planning ability, etc. Patient may become disinhibition related symptoms such as more outspoken excess thoughts, sexually oriented disinhibition, less worried about self, irritability, and have elevation in the mood, loss of tact, and superficiality. Next is a limbic system. Collection of a structure involved in a processing emotions and memories, that it includes hippocampus, amygdala, and hypothalamus. So the limbic system is also called the emotional brain. It is responsible for emotional responsiveness, formation, and the consolidation of memories, olfaction, and motivation, associated with what has been referred to as a bottom-up processing or the experience of information or a stimuli based on a sensory perception. So basically it is called a emotional brain. Generally thought to include hypothalamus, which is responsible for controlling autonomic function including body temperature, hunger, thirst, and sleep. Hippocampus involved in a memory, and the amygdala were responsible for emotional things. Cingulate cortex, which plays important role in a thinking, cingulate cortex, which is responsible for important role in a linking sensation, emotion, and action, including in relation to the formation of a long-term memories for emotionally significant events. Hypothalamus, it regulates autonomic nervous system, and it releases hormones in a blood system, which is responsible for a certain metabolic function of the autonomic nervous system, such as those that control the body temperature, hunger, thirst, and sleep. Also plays a role in emotional, particularly in relation to aversion and displeasure. It appears to play a critical role in triggering a fear response in relation to external stimuli. It has also been implicated in aspect of parenting and attachment behavior. Any damage to the hypothalamus have been associated with changes in sexuality and combativeness and hunger. Next is hippocampus, which is also a part of limbic system. Hippocampus play a role in learning and memory, which is associated with mainly for memory formation. Damage to hippocampus usually result in anterogate amnesia or difficulty in forming a new memories, and can also result in a retrograde amnesia or difficulty in assessing memory formed prior to the insult. Next is amygdala. In broad term, it is we only understand in a way like it is responsible or it regulates the emotions. So basically it plays a role in emotional processing and responding, and informs the body's detection of threatening stimuli or engagement in a flight or a fight reaction. Variations in amygdala functioning have been implicated in many psychological disorders, including obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline personality disorder, and bipolar disorder, as well as these all are the disorders, as well as the dysregulation or aggressiveness behavior, including a hyperaggressiveness. Damage or removal amygdala has been associated with this syndrome. The syndrome name is a Clever-Pucky. Amygdala in a crime. Abnormalities in a brain structure and function could turn people to the crime. Amygdala shrunken or less active in a teenagers with aggressive conduct disorder. Next is cingulate cortex, involved in a processing of emotions and a behavior regulation. So it is located above the corpus callosum, plays an important role in linking sensation, emotion, and action, including in a relation to the formation of a long-term memories or emotionally significant events and dealing with uncertainty. Dysfunction related to the cingulate cortex has been implicated in apathy, depression, and schizophrenia. Anterior cingulate criminal with low activity have a higher risk of reoffending in a cingulate cortex. Thank you everyone.